Now, why is that important? Well, if Jesus died in 33, he's been dead then for about 60 or 70 years. So you've had 60 or 70 years of church life happening. Jesus died in 33. John writes somewhere between 90 and 100. And also at that time, he's an old man. If he's alive at the time of Jesus, and he was probably in his 20s or 30s, he's in his 90s. So you have an old wisdom figure writing this gospel. But you have an old wisdom figure who has looked at 60 years of church life. And you know something? Church life then looked a lot like church life now. They were fighting about everything. They were fighting about, especially about the Eucharist. How often should it be celebrated? Who should preside? Some were celebrating it every day, John's community. Some were celebrating it once a week. Some were celebrating it 4 times a year. Some were celebrating it once a year. Some were calling it the Lord's Supper. Some, I suspect, were calling it the Mass, the way we do as Catholics and so on, but they were fighting about it. So here you have old John, 90 years old, the only living apostle, who's probably the beloved disciple who leaned on Jesus' breast, was so intimate with Christ. And he is writing a last testament for the community. And so at the Last Supper, he says, this is what Jesus did. He took the basin and the towel, and knowing he had come from God, and knowing he was going back to God, and all things were possible, he did this gesture. But it's a particular kind of humility. What kind of humility? Well, it's not just the simple task of, where you say, I'm going to help the janitor today. I'm going to show I'm humble. I'm going to do my own laundry or whatever. That's wonderful, but that's not so much what this is. This is a gesture where you have to, on the basis of something much deeper, swallow all your pride and righteousness and wash the feet of somebody who is very different than you are. This would be the gesture today. You know what John would say if he came back today and he saw, for instance, the most divisive single moral issue in our culture is the issue of abortion. Pro-life, pro-choice. You know what old John would do if he came back today? He'd bring out a basin and towel and he'd say, I want pro-life and pro-choice to wash each other's feet. And then children and babies and women and everybody will win in this culture. But to wash each other's feet, if I'm pro-life, to wash the feet of somebody who's pro-choice, I better not be asleep to who I am. I better be aware that I've come from God and I'm going back to God, and because of that, all things are possible to me, which means I can wash the feet of somebody who's very different than I am. See, for John, that's the ultimate adult gesture. That is the ultimate compassion. See, because it's easy for us to be compassionate to those who are compassionate to us. If somebody comes up to you and says, I think you're the most wonderful woman in the world, you could die for that person. Someone comes up to you and looks at you and says, I think you're a bigoted person, I wish you'd die. Well, it's not so easy to be compassionate. Then you have to start thinking, I've come from God, I'm going back to God. All things are possible to me. I can reach out, I can wash this person's feet. See, to be compassionate as our Father is compassionate. So this is the first point. How do we get past our wounds? How do we get past, the angers and the bitterness and the ideologies and the liberal conservative tension, all the things that separate us? We got to be awake to who we are, knowing we've come from God, knowing we're going back to God, knowing we're now mature women, men, elders in the church. You say, I can do this. I can take the basin and the towel, and I can begin to wash the feet of those who are different from me, and that's going to lead me beyond my wounds. And before I do that, I'll never get beyond my wounds. I'll always be wounded, and I'll always be caught in ideology. I'll always either be a liberal or a conservative. I'll always hate people who hate me, and there'll be bitterness, and it'll be hard to be mellow in a bitter time. That's the first thing. Be compassionate as your Father is compassionate. The compassionate Father who was able to embrace and forgive and love the young in their weakness, and able to embrace and love and forgive the old in their bitterness. A God who can love the people who are pro-life, who can love the people who are pro-choice, who can love liberals, can love conservatives, can love people who are very different. So that's the great challenge. Secondly, Compassion, as Jesus defined it, is going back to what he calls before that time of hardness of heart. Let me talk about that. Before the time of hardness of heart. That's actually Jesus talking about divorce. It's interesting, you have in the Gospel of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Mark and Luke, you have an incident where the scribes and Pharisees come up to Jesus and they question him about divorce. But actually, the text says it was a trick question. They came up, they weren't really sincere. They wanted him to make a pronouncement so he'd get into trouble with one school of thought or the other. Because at the time, in Judaistic thought, there were two schools of thought about divorce. One was more liberal. A man could divorce his wife for really anything. And one was more conservative, where a man could divorce his wife only on grounds of adultery. So they come up to Jesus and they ask him the question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife on any pretext? Now they want him to side with this side or the other, because there's going to be critics on either side, and either way he answers the question, he's in trouble. So what does Jesus do? He says, is it lawful to divorce your wife on any pretext? Jesus says, what did Moses say? So you notice he answers the question with a question. They said, well, Moses said you could divorce your wife on grounds of adultery, basically. Moses was of the stricter school. Then Jesus said, Moses said that because of your hardness of heart. But in the beginning, it wasn't like that. He said in the beginning, God made them male and female. And that's why a man clings to his wife and the two become one flesh. And then he turns, and whenever Jesus needs a child, there's always one there. Okay? And there's a child, and he turns to a child and he says, to such as these, to children is given the kingdom. And whoever welcomes a child welcomes me. What happened there? Well, they come up to Jesus and they ask him a question about divorce. Now, interesting, he's not going to answer the question of divorce. Not at this stage. He's not going to pronounce divorce is right, divorce is wrong. He just takes it 20 times deeper. They say, is it lawful to divorce your wife? What did Moses say? Moses said you could divorce her. Jesus said, he said that because of your hardness of heart, but in the beginning. What does the beginning mean? Remember how Scripture says, in the beginning. That means the time before original sin, before there was sin in the world. See, that's the pristine time, before Adam and Eve committed original sin. In that time, there wasn't any divorce. He said, in that time, people still had mellow hearts. They weren't wounded because there was no sin to wound them. But since sin comes into the world and sin wounds us, and sin hardens our hearts and makes us bitter, and of course you're going to have divorce. After sin in the world, after what we do with the world, people are going to hurt each other and you're going to have divorce. But he said, in the beginning, it wasn't like that. And he said, if you want to see what it looked like in the beginning, look at a child. Little children, their hearts still aren't hardened. There's still a pristine purity. And the younger they are, the greater that purity and pristineness. That's why people want to see babies. Babies bring a special blessing. And when they ordain a young priest, people come up for a blessing from the priest. It's beautiful. That's why people go to see a little baby. A baby comes from the other world. It brings the newness. It brings a vulnerability that can only come from God. And Jesus is saying, go back. Try to get your heart back to that time. Not to the childishness of a child, but to the childlikeness of the child. Go back to that time before getting wounded hardened your heart. And out of that, you answer all questions, whether it's questions about divorce, whether it's questions about anything. But he says in our present situation, we're going to have divorce because we have hard hearts. We've all been wounded. There's bitterness. There isn't God's compassion as you see in the child. It's a powerful challenge. Go back to that time before your hardness of heart. The third incident I want to use, or third way of defining mellowness, is this. It's Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I call it teaching us how to carry our solitude at a high level. I borrowed that expression from a Czechoslovakian writer called Ivan Klima, who's a wonderful novelist. And in he's got these little autobiographical books. And in one of them, he talks about how he grew up in Czechoslovakia before 1968 under the communist regime. And he said, I grew up as a young man with no religion,